Hi, it's you with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of critical thinking. Now, you could call it logical sequence thinking or scientific method thinking, the Socratic method and so on. So there are various names. I'm not sure they all mean exactly the same thing, but you get my drift on that. So there's a video recently that was, I think it went viral, doing the rounds where a teacher, I think in North America, was teaching a very rudimentary form of critical thinking to a student. And which is, you would think, a teacher's fucking job, for Christ's sakes. But the teacher was talking to a student who was saying, well, I've heard that so-and-so is a racist fucking Nazi, Hitler, bigot, yeah. And therefore they must be the bigot. They must be the object of hatred and scorn, and must be disincluded from polite society, and so on. So the teacher, I'm paraphrasing here, but the teacher said, "Okay, well, let's think. Look at this. On what basis are you saying that?" "Oh, I don't know. I heard it somewhere." Whoa, which, by the way, you will always get from. So-and-so's a Nazi. Well, how do you know that? Heard it somewhere. Reminds me actually of nearly 30 years ago now, there was a radical feminist being interviewed, and she was saying that, how violent men are, and they, all the murders in the world of women are caused by evil fascist Nazi men. And the journalist back then, before there was, extreme leftist views on things, the journalist said, well, how do you know that? And the woman sort of didn't seem to know, the feminist didn't seem to know what to do. And then so she just shrugged and said, I heard it somewhere. I remember seeing that. That was an interview, I think I was in England at the time, channel surfing, and I saw that. I was there on business. But anyway, so the student had just heard it somewhere. So the teacher walked them through it. Well, okay, let's have a look at the statements. That statement, or a number of statements perhaps, but those statements are not racist or bigoted or Nazi or fascist or Hitler or anything like that. They're someone's opinion. You may not like their opinion, but that's got nothing to do with them being a Nazi. And can you find anything in that statement that says that they're racist or that this or that? So the student had to admit no. So the assignment was, well, bring me back statements that from this person that are very clear and in expressing racist or any incorrect or factually incorrect sentiment, and then we can talk some more. And the student couldn't or wasn't able to, and so the conclusion the student drew, well, okay, that person is not a racist. And therefore I was incorrect in calling them a racist or offensive. And just if you're a student, just saying, I heard it somewhere, that's hardly sort of intense or high-powered kick-ass research. It's bullshit. It's mob think or crowd think. Coming back now to that teacher who behaved, I thought, reasonably and sensibly and did nothing wrong at all, was fired. Which I was... The teacher seemed to be a bit surprised as well, but I was also. I thought, well, what have they done wrong? Now, as I understand it, at least, they came to this teacher with a sum of money and said, we want you to go sign this non-disclosure agreement, and then we want you out of here. The crime that the teacher committed was to, as I understand it, teach critical thinking. So let's have a look at convince a student that they can't be part of the baying social media, you're Hitler, the mob, and which is very much what the globalists want today. They want that baying mob. They're part of the globalist foot soldier regime, and they want it. They need it to go after people who they don't like. Because if all you need to accuse someone of being Hitler is that you heard it somewhere that they were, then that's a very, very low bar and consequently a very easy way to scare up a screaming social media mob. And if you look at the people, say, at pro-Palestine protests, any sort of street, climate change doesn't matter, anything, nearly all of them, other than the agitators and the ones that are organising it, nearly all of them are just, well, climate change is going to end the planet. How do you know that? Heard it somewhere. and so on it goes. So this is very much how the mobs, the device is used to get the mobs out on the street. And there's no way that the education institutions are very much hand in glove with the agitators getting those mobs on the street. So the last thing they want is impartial, independent, critical thinking being taught. They can't tolerate it because it means the end to the mobs, which is why it's much harder to put mobs together years ago than it is today. Bear in mind, there are armies of kids that are being waved through into senior high school and then waved through into university that wouldn't have made it out of junior high school years ago. So they had to go and get jobs and go out and do things. So it's much harder to scare up a mob when they're all out doing apprenticeships or jobs or whatever. They're much less likely to be interested. Whereas if you've got a bunch of very low IQ students, bear in mind that something in the order of 3/4+ of the students at university today would not have made it out of junior high school years ago. So you've got this large body of kids, the low IQ kids, that are very easy to manipulate on the, I heard it somewhere. Coming back to now the concept of critical thinking, I was going back to my own, and as far as I know, that kid that was talking to the teacher about critical thinking was high school. So just going back to my own sort of recollections of high school critical thinking, the critical thinking differed subject to subject. So I remember we had history teachers that because, or they believed, and I'm glad they did, they put forward the nuance of history. That if you look just superficially, you'll see one thing, but as you start to drill down, look at all the causes, myriad causes and effects, you'll start to see a far more nuanced picture. And you have to be able to understand and comprehend that degree of nuance and to be able to relate each, in a matrix of interaction, relate each event to another, which means you need a certain amount of brain power to sort of cut through that, which gets pretty thick and intense at times. It's easy to say, well, the French Revolution was caused because the king was an asshole. Well, that's pretty superficial. The reality is the causes were many and varied, and the king being an asshole, or allegedly an asshole, was really a very small part of that in the final analysis. But in order to sit down and crunch through the whole thing. Now, also the teachers, so in order to teach critical thinking, you must be able to consider opposing viewpoints. You must be able to read the book that the guy, the right historian who is heavily invested in one particular point of view, and to be able to detach yourself from that writer's prejudice and be able to see the wider issues, and then read a historian who has a very different point of view. And again, you must be able to see the issues without investing in any of the prejudices or presumptions, whether they be of the time or of the current time, particularly of the current time, because values and attitudes today are quite different to what they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and so on. Now, this was probably one of the best education at that age, best educations I could have had, because it forced the students to think critically. The teacher gave out quite a long reading list that went beyond what the Department of Education reading list was. But even the Department of Education reading list did accept the nuance of history at the time, whereas today they don't, which seems odd. Or the only nuance they see is the social justice angle rather than the historical angle. So that encouraged us to that reading list that the teachers gave out. I found out, I think I was only I may have been the only student actually that went through that whole list. So I got all the books, which means I had to go to the library, and some of them I even had to buy, and bust my ass reading, which I did, and that was a great not that I realised at the time, but that was a great education, able to see and understand nuance, and again to be able to detach myself. So this is very important when you look at critical thinking, because it's not something you can just say to someone, "Hey, think critically." You really have to show people how to do it, and the Socratic method of asking questions to move them along, or to encourage them to read widely and so on, is part of that, I think. But then I believe people have to be taught to think critically. I mean, some people maybe, and I wasn't one of them, by the way, has the brain power to do that, just straight off the bat. But I wasn't one of them. I had to be shown how to do it. And now I think back to other teachers, for example, in literature appreciation or poetry appreciation. We had, I think, one class. Was it a week or a fortnight? It wasn't certainly wasn't every day, but in literature appreciation and poetry appreciation. So getting a poem of I don't know, Gerard Manley Hopkins or something. I don't know, it was quite a few, and appreciating the poetry. Now, some of the poetry or literature appreciation was Department of Education guidelines. You will tell the students about this and that, and about this and that way of appreciating the literature. In some cases, the teachers, not many of them, went beyond that, and again tried to develop in us, the students, an ability to think critically. But there were many teachers, not all, but there were many teachers in many different subjects that would try and encourage you to think through the issues. How did you arrive at this? And this is the devices through which, as in the thinking methodologies, you can use to arrive at these conclusions. Don't get hung up on there's an absolute right or an absolute wrong, but understand that how you reach these conclusions and the discipline, particularly the thinking discipline that you use to reach the conclusions, are important. This is extended in tertiary education. And this is what university is all about, to try and train your ability to think without prejudice, to think critically of complex issues, and the framework through which, as in the discipline thought framework, through which you could think through complicated issues and then arrive at sensible and balanced and well-informed conclusions. So tertiary education was meant to take that a step further from, say, senior high school. You didn't really get that much of it in junior high school. Some of it you did, but now there are subjects where critical thinking just in itself, I mean, 1 + 1 is always going to equal 2. You don't have to have a whole lot of critical thinking capacity to apply that. You can learn that to some degree. Now, once you get into more advanced mathematics like simultaneous equations and things like that, then a capacity for critical thought does come in, and you get starting to move into the area of, say, disciplines that you would see to a further extent in, for example, engineering, bridge building or something like that. Load bearing on a bridge and the like. So the amount of critical and the type of critical thinking, maybe that's a better way of putting it, on different subjects varied. In the advanced mathematics, critical thinking, sure. Basic mathematics, not so much. Now, in literature appreciation, there was an attitude, well, who the fuck cares what this author meant or that poet meant? Big deal. But I took a slightly different view. That trying to understand, because words are very important. So in legal documents, words are vital in understanding them. Well, they were once. Words don't mean much when it comes to when you're trying to put Donald Trump in prison on bullshit charges. But anyway, this idea of appreciating literature. So say I'm thinking of some of the books at high school that things like novels that we were assigned to read and then discuss in an appreciation, and have to do essays on it as well. Brideshead Revisited, the one that just popped in my mind, or F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, and those sort of things. Now, whether you liked the books or not, I found them entertaining. Some of them I didn't, and some of them at the time I thought, well, what a load of bullshit. But then books I came to appreciate when I was a bit older. The teacher would go, or some teachers would go through and say, okay, what does F. Scott Fitzgerald mean when he says so and so and so and so? What's he referring to there? Now, some of it was beyond the students' life experience. Of course, they wouldn't know. Like a real estate transaction in Rhode Island or wherever the Gatsby character thing was set. This is something that a kid, an Australian kid, wouldn't know about anyway. So that appreciation is, I think, a little bit more difficult and somewhat pointless in as much as they can't relate to it. But as in, they're not real estate magnates in Northeast America. But there were other expressions or terms that were used that were a matter of interpretation and appreciation. And if you stop and slow down a little bit and think about, okay, they've said this, how does it fit into that paragraph or that chapter or sentence, and so on. So critical thinking was taught, but not all teachers taught that. Some just followed the Department of Education guidelines, and that's it. Now, more junior school, you were required, do you have the capacity, the discipline to remember and regurgitate? And some relationship between information, but essentially regurgitation. And I think that's okay for younger, and I think that's okay for younger students, where comprehension levels wouldn't necessarily be that high anyway. So if they can train you to sit there and absorb information and retain it and then use it later, as in the next year or whatever, as a critical thinking or some sort of interrelationship that may be the beginning building blocks of critical thinking, then that's okay. So regurgitation's fine. By the time you're reaching sort of year 10, I think, as I recall, the critical thinking side began to kick in, and the educational courses had much more. Now, coming back to the critical thinking, when I think of all the teachers that did teach critical thinking, they were pretty much all men, certainly back in the day. And the critical thinking taught by female teachers was close to zip. But I do recall that the female teachers going along with ideology. Now, again, this was in the earlier days. This is before, all the woke stuff exploded. But you could already see the nascent sort of move, the nascent appearance of that. And again, we're talking teachers, for fuck's sake. So many of them are communists. But the idea, one of the teachers was a screaming communist, but he still taught critical thinking. And you wouldn't know which way he voted. I remember, just finishing senior high school, and the final sort of teacher-student get-together thing, and there was ended up as people were moving around, sitting next to this teacher. Didn't realize he started coming out with all this communist bullshit I'd never known, and he was able to conceal it sort of fully and still teach the course, and again, even teach critical thinking and things like. I think he was a mathematics teacher, but again, dealing with things like, the simultaneous equations and do IDX and all that shit. So I don't recall, there was an English teacher that came in quite briefly who did teach critical thinking and appreciating literature, such as novels like The Great Gatsby and so on. But I don't remember any of the others. All the teachers teaching critical thinking were all men. Maybe that says something about critical thinking and its applicability and desirability. Now, coming to the idea of critical thinking, what people from former communist bloc or third world countries, India and so on, they love to run around saying, well, we teach critical thinking in our schools, not like the decadent West and so on. And so you have, I was looking at all the countries or areas that claim that Romania is an example, and there's a Romanian TV channel, which is quite good, actually. I suggest you have a look at it. And he, among others, Indian channels claim that they teach critical thinking. Now, let's suppose that's the case, that their schools teach critical thinking and have done for decades, many decades. Now, why is it that those countries are not only dirt poor, hopelessly corrupt, and where the majority of the population can't wait to get the fuck out and go to the West, and they seem to have, no possibilities. And wherever I've met, for example, Romanians in the workplace, they all seem to be sleazy, low-life gypsy hustlers, always on the game, always trying to engage in sort of shadowy, sleazy behaviour. they act they act like Bond villains and so on. And so this I don't know, always on the hustle, and so if they do have critical thinking skills, they must have studied it through correspondence or something like that, and just all got lost in the post. But I haven't seen any examples. So from India and all these places where critical thinking is supposedly taught, why are they all dirt poor basket countries that people want to leave? And if they do have these critical thinking skills, how come they're so fucking useless, corrupt, and lazy? I don't get all that. So anyway, critical thinking. That's my take on it. But there was quite a bit of it around when I was at high school, and best I can tell is almost none now. When I talk to like people we know have got children in high school and that sort of thing, or in college, they seem to have zero critical thinking capacity. So obviously they're not being taught it. And by the way, they don't seem to think that's an issue. I've heard somewhere that so and so is Hitler. Good enough. That's it. Well, don't you want to do your own research? Nah. So I think that's something of a tragedy, but it's being heavily and brutally imposed upon us by the globalist cabal, and we should push back against it. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.